Hello and welcome to Europa Universalis 4. I am Lord Forwind, here with a guide on how to play England, Great Britain. Seeing as it's one of the more popular nations to play in the game, I figured I would just briefly go over it. Some decisions, some events, some basic strategies. So, one of the first things the English have to deal with in Europa is France. You are currently in the middle of the 100 Years' War. Currently you're at peace, but there will be an event in a couple of years that's called the Surrender of Maine. It's this province here. Essentially, there's a treaty saying that you owe this land to France. Usually, if you refuse to take it, refuse to give it back, there's a war between you and France. That is a very interesting war, considering you're considered to be the aggressor against France, which means if you attack France, France will call in its ally, Provence, or any other allies it might gain in the short term. That means one of the first decisions you have to make as England is, do you want to try and fight for France, or do you want to abandon your French lands? If you're abandoning your French lands, you can pretty much just give them back to France in the long run. You can lose the 100 Years' War, essentially, or you could remove the estates and return the land from France. Fighting France at this point in history is pretty much the only point at which England can fight them. You're outnumbered, they have better generals, you'll be in the War of the Roses, they might have more allies, but it's your best shot. The only way to win that is to ally yourself to pretty much Castile, Aragon, Austria. You usually can get alliance with Austria and Castile if they dislike France. And sometimes you can bribe them into a war with France because you don't actually start at war with France, which is kind of amusing. Which means if you could persuade allies to join you in the war, you could attack them before the Surrender of Maine's event and everything kick off. At that point, you really just beat up their army, occupy their land. I'd honestly focus about sieging down the lands. You actually start off with a fairly good general in Richard Plantagenet. If you group up your two armies, transport them over, usually the French won't directly attack you. 99% of the time, though, you want to get a military advisor either with discipline or morale. You probably also want to focus military tech, try and get a lead there, and mainly just hope that your allies come through and help you, because France is extraordinarily powerful with lots of manpower. So, that's the big major event you have to deal with at the beginning of the game. The other one is you have the War of the Roses disaster firing. Now, in all the playthroughs I've done of England, I would say this event fires 90% of the time. As you can see, you have to have an heir, or you have to be in a regency council, or you have to be a lesser part of a personal union. You can't have a dynasty of York, because stability less than 1, and you have to have a pretty good ruler on the throne. So there's a lot of conditions, plus your current ruler, Henry Lancaster, the 000 ruler, who sometimes lives to be 70, is absolutely horrible. So one of the first priorities after you consider what your strategy is with France is to consider what your strategy is as England. There's also another event that'll fire, but I'll go into that in a tiny bit. 99% of the time you're going to get the War of the Roses. So you got to figure out how to deal with it. You have to pick one or two sides of the dynasty, the Yorkist or the, I think it's the Plantagenet. Yeah. And it's the War of the Roses, Red Rose, White Rose. If you grow up in an English-speaking country or, you know your history, you know that this is a pretty major event. It was very complicated. There's some great YouTube videos on it that try and explain it, and it all goes down to intermarriages, warfare, and anything else. Surprisingly, this game makes it a lot easier to deal with. I really think it should be harder. But essentially you'll have an event where different provinces in your land, like Yorkshire, the Yorkist area, will gain a ton of unrest, and there will be rebels uprising. If you defeat them all, you will then either be able to keep your dynasty on the throne, or you will get an event that allows you to have Henry Tudor take the throne. It's the choice at the end of it. It's called, "It's time for peace. Let us join our two houses together in marriage." And it will put Henry Tudor on the throne. He is a 3 admin, 4 diplomatic, 2 military ruler. That's a fixed one. And he will start the Tudor dynasty. So that does mean you will lose the Lancaster, not Plantagenet, Lancaster or Yorkist dynasties that are on your throne. So it's worth considering, especially if you get a royal marriage or you're thrown on a dynasty, which is actually quite possible based off the Habsburgs not having an heir if you royal marriage them. So it's something to keep an eye on. 90% of the time you go with Henry Tudor because altogether his stats are a 9 ruler, which is above average, which is fairly good overall. Once that's done, there will be another event that fires early on. I'm just throwing these 2 events out there because they can all fire during the War of the Roses and make things hopelessly complex. It's the Lollard Rebellion and Uprising. Essentially, the Lollards will appear and they will essentially trigger some pretty nasty events in terms of unrest. You have a choice. You can stop them, which you will get provinces that have plus 20 unrest. You will get a nice little modifier, plus 1 tolerance to the true faith and plus 1 yearly papal influence. But if you let the Lollards exist on their own, you will lose 1 yearly papal influence. Catholicism will get a 5% reform desire, firing Protestantism earlier, which you usually want to take. But you also get plus 1 tolerance of heretics, which can help you be stable if you don't go Protestant or Reformed. So all 3 of those events can fire around the same time, which means the early game for England is rough. Luckily, you have several major strengths going for you. You've got a pretty good amount of development. You actually are almost equivalent to France. If you were to even take 1 or 2 provinces, you'd surpass France. And you also have probably one of the world's strongest starting navies at the time. I'll just throw this up here. Actually, you do have the world's largest navy. Starting on, you have 33 ships, but what's important is you have 6 heavy ships. Essentially, if you play your cards right, you take their wonderful little Royal Navy. Here we go. And you put them out to intercept enemy fleets, or you just station them out there. No one will ever be landing a single army on England, which is key because once they do, you're pretty much doomed. So that means one of your strategies, never let your enemies land on England if you can help it, which means strengthening your navy is a priority throughout the game. Luckily, as England, you have a couple nice little ideas that help you. You get from your traditions, plus 20% morale of navies, plus 33% embargo efficiency. And your first idea will give you heavy ship combat ability, plus 10, and yearly naval tradition, plus 25. Further on, you'll get sailor maintenance, negative 10%, and sailor recovery, 10%, which means you probably don't actually have to take a single naval idea in the entire game, which is pretty unusual if you think about it, because most nations have to take naval ideas if you want to be a massive naval power. Naval ideas are overall really weak, but sometimes for Portugal, Castile, England, France, it might be worth taking. Denmark's another one that could also do it. Essentially, all you have to do is maintain and upgrade your navy. You may not even need to place more than 6 heavy ships in there, as the case may be. You don't, oddly enough, have an achievement for building up an English Royal Navy. You do have 2 achievements, but I'll try to remember to go into those later. Other things to remember with England. You start out with a very unique form of government. You have the English monarchy, based on privileges defined in the Magna Carta. And it gives you a parliament. It's the only parliament in the game early on. And it functions much like the other parliaments do. It does have, if I remember, some different issues you can push through as compared to other parliaments. Plus, you get it earlier. I'm a little torn on the parliament mechanic. It true does help. It gives you, as you can see right now, London has a seat, plus production, tax, manpower, and sailors modifier, which is good. On the other hand, if you do not have a debate in parliament, you actually get a penalty of 0.1 corruption a year, which you can actually handle as the English pretty easily with your basic allocation of money, or if you go down espionage, etc., etc., etc. But of course, once you pick an issue, then you have to try and usually bribe the members of parliament to vote for you. The best one usually for me is at least allow use of crown lands. Navy tradition's another one. And just like that, we passed advisor cuts -10%. So it's a parliament. It's useful. You can get some nice morale, core cost, extra settlers, faster settlization, not a word. But it can be very useful on that front to give you little temporary bonuses or reduce modifiers. Let's see, what else is England? Well, let's look at the other ideas. You've got plus 20% goods produced, which is really huge. You got +1 diplomatic relations, which is nice. It's not a huge issue because as England, you're pretty much removed from colonial affairs. Unless you conquer France, Union France, then annex France, then you're a land power. But if you lose your French lands, you're a naval power. So that works out well for you. You get navigation acts plus 10%, trade, you get plus 20% global settlers with city on the hill, you get 5 discipline, which is a nice little bonus, but not massive, and you get really useless +1 leader without upkeep. I mean, I guess if you're running around the world, it could be useful, but considering you can take a general, put it in charge of one army, march over to another army, put the general in charge of that army with no travel time, it's not a huge issue, you just got to manage your generals. Now, in terms of starting locations in England, oh, sorry, not England, the British Isles. England's starting position, the British Isles. Obviously, you have Scotland to the north. Sadly, you can't attack Scotland easily because they're guaranteed by France. Technically, I guess you could attack them and then use your navy to stop France from conquering your land. But in the meantime, France is going to occupy every single one of your French provinces. So, deal with France. Then think about dealing with Scotland. You'll get a couple missions eventually to deal with Scotland. The most common is vassalize Scotland. If Scotland has no allies, which they either tend to get France as an ally or lose France as an ally, and that tends to be it other than Irish miners, it's a very viable mission to take. Otherwise, just fabricate claims and conquer them. They have no real hope of resisting you. They do have a very large land force limit modifier, but it's not enough. As you can see, there's their army 15, there's part of our army with 14. It's very easy to beat them. Plus you've got a navy, they don't. In terms of Ireland, you're located to one province. England used to own more, but they've been pushed back to this one region called the Pale. Essentially, it includes Dublin, one of the major areas in Ireland. And none of these nations in Ireland are a threat. At most, they have 5 troops. One of my favorite strategies, personally, is to go up to Leinster here, one of the counts that tends to like you fairly early on. In fact, all of them fairly are either threatened or friendly towards you. These guys apparently are the only ones who don't like you that much. And make them a vassal, conquer the land using, usually they get claims on these lands or will be making claims. And feed them all to your Irish minor vassal. Once they've got all the land, they'll either form Ireland or you simply annex them, and there you get Ireland without much trouble. Usually you can, at that point, if you haven't expanded much, you can do accept Irish culture, and you'll never have Irish rebellions, unlike modern day life and historical life, where the Irish did not get along well with the English. And I really do not like the mechanics in Ireland currently, because it's too easy once you take over never to lose those provinces. Then obviously, if you've got a strong vassal there, you turn on Scotland with your vassal, you easily conquer them. Now, an important point to note is Norway controls the islands up here, Orkney, the Faroes, and I always forget this one, whatever it's called. And at some point, Norway will get an event, and they will sell them to Scotland. So it's usually worth waiting until that point. Usually they'll do it before Denmark integrates them. So that's a very possible thing. But it's usually worth it because you'll pick up 1 or 2 more provinces. And if you're going for like trying to unite the entire British Isles, you need those provinces. At some point, you'll probably want to form the British nation, either diplomatically or militarily. All it will really do is it will change your name to Great Britain. If you've got Scotland as a vassal, you'll inherit them, which can be nice if you can do it. And increased centralization allows you to just get the lands less autonomous quicker. In terms of expanding outside of the British Isles and France, there's a couple options. If you're going for the land route and fighting France, obviously you expand into France. Another target that's possible is Burgundy, who is pretty well hated by everybody else around them. I mean, not right now, but they usually declare war on Liege and get the Emperor and get trounced, or they die and there's the Burgundy in succession. Both events you kind of want to avoid because it usually gives the land to Austria or Castile. If you're allies with Castile, then it's great for you. But usually picking up like Picardy and Artois, I don't know French. If you take over those, that will give you a couple more development. Plus, there are almost 15, 17 development provinces. If you can snag Antwerp, which will give you control of all the that in Holland and then up here. But it'll give you control of a lot more of the center of trade in the English Channel. Obviously, since it's an end node and you're England, you want to get as much trade going to the English Channel as possible, which is quite easy. Speaking of the English Channel, you will notice here there are a fair amount of trade routes moving into the English Channel, but there are some that don't. Specifically some of the ones that flow into the Sevilla trade node, which is kind of frustrating. You can pressure them to steer to the English Channel, but it's a little difficult considering how strong Portugal, Spain is, Castile, to getting their trade. It really depends on colonial nations. Another point is to recognize that Champagne here can flow to the English Channel, which means if France is pulling trade here, you can usually steer trade up into the English Channel too. Another good place to steer trade from is the Lubeck Trade node, which tends to have a lot of trade because of the Lubeck and the Kalmar Union at Norway, Sweden, Denmark. All of those will steer trade, the Hanseatic League, to here, and then you can simply trade it, pull it on towards the English Channel. Other nations that are important, you can try and take over Brittany. They're a pretty viable nation to conquer, especially if they've lost like alliances with France or Burgundy. Usually they get an alliance with Burgundy. Sometimes you'll inherit Portugal, sometimes you won't, sometimes they'll become an enemy, but usually, since you start off with an alliance with them, I just stay allied with them. Does chew up a diplomatic slot, but it's usually not that bad. Plus, then you're not really competing with them for colonies. In terms of colonies and idea groups, I'm going to dive into idea groups before I go to colonialization because it's kind of all tied together. For England, you don't have a specific focus for idea other than trade and colonization at some point. You usually want to try and take either a military idea if you intend to fight France. I found the best is usually defensive. Some people argue quality, quantity, probably not too useful versus France. You'll probably have about equivalent troops early on, but later on their morale will become too large. But defensive ideas, if you get that plus 15 morale early on, it will easily allow you to beat all your enemies early on. So that's usually what I pick. Another option that the AI and some other people are fond of is going economic, just because it allows you to build taller easier. And as England, you should be fairly safe and not really expanding too much into Europe, obviously, unless you've conquered France. Trade ideas are not that useful early on. Also important to note, you will not have the colonialization range to reach the New World probably until your second idea group, level 7 admin and level 7 Diplo. Because as you can see on colonial range, you get 115 range at level 7. Up until that point, you have really no way of reaching the New World unless you've conquered like Portugal or something. At which point, that's when you usually want to take exploration ideas, get your explorer going, explore the world, colonize the world. People's views on where to colonize vary. In terms of my personal preference, I try and snag Bermuda, which is out here in the ocean, just because then it allows you to pretty much colonize the entire coastline. Oddly enough, it's easier for you to jump to the islands of the Caribbean and then go to get Bermuda afterwards, rather than trying to get it first. So usually you want to snag some of the Caribbean islands. Obviously, they're not visible at the moment. I usually go for the Caribbean first, then move on to the 13 colonies, the American East Coast, and then usually move up to Canada, at which point you can either go for Panama, conquer the Aztecs, you could even take on the Inca if you want, and then go from there. Other points to note is you should probably try and snag South Africa down there because it's a pretty good trade location. You're going to want to steer trade. You can steer it to the English Channel from the nodes down here near Mali and stuff, which are important to remember. And other things, you obviously can try and recreate the British Empire by conquering most of India, colonizing Australia. I've never really found a great rush to get to Australia, but you should pick it up before someone else colonizes. Obviously, I think you need, what is it? I think it's 5 or 7 provinces in a area, and then they'll form a colonial nation and start slowly colonizing on their own. For your third idea group, now this is assuming you've taken either a military admin and then taken a colonial one, you have the choice. You can either try and say, well, I've already got an exploration, so I might as well go for expansion, give the extra colonist, a merchant, settler increase, recruitment, recreation, shipbuilding time, trade power, and state maintenance. I actually find this to be one of the better idea groups for England, so usually you want to pick it up as your third. It'll speed up your colonialization efforts, it'll give you more diplomats, etc., etc., etc. If you don't pick that, influence is not a bad one, nor is snagging economic if you haven't. At that point, you can really pick any of the idea groups. England doesn't have any specific bonuses. At some point, you want to take trade ideas just so you can steer trade better. You probably at some point want to get quantity ideas just so you can compete late Europa. Innovative's not too useful. Religious, I've never found it too useful. If you go Protestant, maybe. If you stay Catholic, not particularly useful. Administrative can be useful, obviously, if you're conquering lots of land, like India. Other than that, you shouldn't be conquering lots of land. You should be colonizing it, which means this core creation cost is going to be totally useless. Humanist ideas can be nice, but you shouldn't have too much disorder in your country. The big benefits, obviously, would be the tolerance and the unrest and the religious unity. Not too useful. Espionage, on the other hand, is not too bad. Specifically, the increased embargo efficiency is not bad, considering you already have 33 from your ideas. You'll get some pretty crazy privateering and embargo efficiency, plus the yearly corruption is nice to handle. Diplomatic, take it or leave it. Trade you want. Maritime, I don't find it that useful. Influence, if you're going to get vassals, possibly could be useful. Aristocratic, not that useful. Offensive is pretty good for England because you want a highly disciplined, strong army. Avoid naval ideas unless you're losing naval wars. It's not needed as England. Other than that, the only other things to watch out for is at some point you'll get an event where you can create a star chamber, which looks really good. -1 unrest, all these other bonuses. Don't take it. If you do take it, you're very, very likely to fire the English Civil War, which will take place in the Age of Absolutism. One of the +1 per month modifiers is having a star chamber. So if you avoid it, that shouldn't be an issue. If you do trigger that, you have a choice to stay as the English monarchy or try and form I think it's a bureaucratic despotism and under Cromwell, and you can then convert into a republic from a monarchy there. There are a lot of other little historical events within England, but I'm not going to focus on them. They're not the most useful. Fun things to do, if you're up for it, is you can try and get elected Holy Roman Emperor. If Protestantism's doing really well, try and get elected during the League War. As England itself, you only have particularly 2 unique achievements. You have one night in Paris. As England, own and have a core on Paris. Don't form another country unless it's Great Britain, which is very doable if you can beat France. And the other one is an industrial evolution. Have all of England and have 25 development in each province there. This is important to note that England includes this area. I'll try and pull up a regional map. It includes up to here, but it doesn't include into Scotland. So you should be pretty well off just trying to... You have to get all of this. I don't know if per se they are included into it. Wales. I think they might be. I don't remember. I've got it before. And that's the fun thing. Other than that, you can do forests for trees, which have like 500 heavy ships and no loan, quite possible. And you'll get, colony down under. If you get Australia, you can get 7 colonial nations. Essentially, you can play them either as a war power by conquering France or a colonial nation by colonizing. Alliances that you particularly want, you want to keep Portugal. Castile's a pretty good one if you can get it and keep it. Other than that, there's really no other alliances that you need. No one's going to be able to invade your islands, assuming that you lost your French lands. And really Denmark, maybe Austria, possibly. Other than that, you want to avoid getting into too many wars out here. Russia, for example, would not be a bad one if you can get it, because they tend to not invade the mess that is the HRE. So that's always a positive thing. If you do conquer France, you definitely want to keep Castile on your side, probably Austria, probably try and get the Pope on your side, and then overall just conquer this region. HRE is possible, it's difficult. I've never had any success playing a diplomatic game as England and trying to get personal unions and stuff. I'm sure it's been done. But overall, I think that's it for England. Obviously, you want to set France as a rival, probably Burgundy and Scotland. You get some nice little missions with these, like reclaim lands. You do start out with one core that you don't own at the moment. It's Armagnac. I said it wrong, sorry. In southern France. It's a 15 development province. You won't get it back unless you kill France. Plain and simple. Other than that, the world is pretty much your oyster. Try and get the Panama Canal, try and get the Suez Canal, which might involve a war with the Ottomans. You can do it all. England's a very, very powerful nation, and literally by conquering Scotland and Ireland, you'll probably stay at about this development. You'll lose about 100 development or so if you lose your French provinces. But you can build tall as England very easily. Plus, with Parliament, you can get missions that allow development cheaper, give random tax space to provinces, on and on and on. Anyway, that is it for this guide. I hope you guys enjoyed it. England's a fun nation. Can be difficult at the beginning with France, the War of the Roses, the Lollards, etc. But once you get over that hump, you're pretty good for England overall. If you guys have any other questions, comments, advice, leave them below in the comments. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this guide. And check out some of the other ones I've done, is like France, Castile, the Ottomans, the Byzantines, the Teutonic Order, Brandenburg, etc. So thank you all for watching. Bye for now.